I do want to join in tonight with Robert in welcoming those who may be visiting with us. We're thankful for your presence. We invite you to open your Bibles and study with us for a few minutes tonight. Tonight I want to talk to you about a love song. A love song. Do you remember when you were dating having a song? Do you remember that there was a song that you and the person you were dating laid claim to? It became your song. And somehow the words of that song came to represent your relationship. And when you heard that song on the radio, you thought of one another. And it may be immature and it might be silly to do that, but probably many of us did that when we were young and we were in love. And so tonight I want to talk to you about a love song. Now the song that I want to talk to you about tonight was not only a love song, but it was a hit song. In fact, it reached the top of the charts. And even at the danger of giving away the song that I'm talking about, it was a song that was written by a king. Now, you have any idea what song I have in mind? Well, some of you probably are thinking of Elvis Presley and Love Me Tender. And that was a great song, wasn't it? It was a song perhaps if you were growing up in that day and age that was your song. It became your song. It represented your relationship. Or maybe you came along after that and you had a different song. But the song that we're going to talk about tonight is a love song. You go to the book of, or the Song of Solomon. As you go and you look at that song, you'll find out very quickly that this song is a love song. In fact, the word love is used 26 times in this song. It could not be more about love than what it is. And it is a song about married love. It is a song that the husband sings verses to the wife, and the wife in turn sings verses back to the husband. It's a love song. It used to generally be interpreted as a song between Christ and the church, and some still see the book that way, but most today probably see the book simply as a song about married love. A song that a husband and a wife might sing to one another in marriage. Now, as we think about this song that we'll be studying tonight, you'll find out in verse 1 that it was the Song of Songs. Now, Solomon wrote a number of songs, a number of proverbs, and a number of things that are worth considering, but this is described as the Song of Songs. It reached the top of the charts. It was the biggest hit, at least in his mind, that he ever penned, that he ever wrote. It stands out in his mind because it captured how he felt about his bride. It was the Song of Songs. And notice, it says in verse 1, which is Solomon's. Now Solomon became king, became the wisest, most well-known king of Israel. And this was his song about married love. Now, as we take a look at this song, we want to use chapter 2 as the primary text for our lesson, but we're really going to be all over the book, and we're going to talk about this song that this husband and wife, this groom and bride, sing to one another. Now, as we take a look at the context, in the first 7 verses of chapter 2, we see a contrast. We're going to see that Solomon feels about his bride in a way that's different than he feels about anybody else. And we're going to see that the Shulamite, his bride, feels differently about him than she does about anyone else. And there is a huge contrast that takes place here. And it's a beautiful contrast. Notice in verse 2, as the lily among thorns, so is my love among the daughters. Now here is Solomon looking at his bride, and he describes her as a lily among thorns. Now there could not be a greater contrast than that. The contrast of a lily compared to thorns. And he says she's a lily and everyone else out there, they're just thorns. Everyone else out there will prick you and hurt you and is a bother to you, but not her. She is a lily among thorns. She is pure. She is more lovely than anyone else out there. She's a lily among thorns. Now later on in the book, if you turn over to chapter 6 and verse 13, you're going to see that some are asking Solomon what he sees in her. And I suppose that there were those that looked at Solomon and they thought, you're the son of a king. You're going to be king. You have all of these riches at your disposal. You can have anyone that you want. Why do you want her? What is so special about this Shulamite? Notice what he says in verse 13. He says, "Return, return, O Shulamite. Return, return, that we may look upon thee. What will you see in the Shulamite?" As it were, the company of two armies. They said, "What do you see in her? What is it that's so special about her? Why have you chosen her out of all the people that you could have chosen?" And then beginning in chapter 7, really in the last part of verse 13, but in chapter 7 especially, he begins to describe her. He begins to tell you what he sees in her. He says in verse 1, "How beautiful are thy feet with shoes, O princess daughter. The joints of thy thighs are like jewels, the work of the hands of a cunning workman. Thy navel is like a round goblet, which wanteth not liquor. Thy belly is like a heap of wheat, set about with lilies." And then he goes ahead to describe on and on. In verse 4, he describes her neck. In verse 5, he says, "Thine head." And then in verse 6, "How fair and how pleasant art thou, O love, for delights." And he just goes on and on in very graphic terms describing her and how beautiful she is to him. And so that's the way that he sees her, as a lily among thorns. But go back to Song of Solomon in verse 3 and you will see how she sees him. You see, it's supposed to be a mutual thing. It isn't supposed to be a one-sided thing where one sees the other in these glowing and wonderful terms and the other one doesn't respond in kind. No, marriage is supposed to be something that is mutual. Notice in verse 3, "As the apple tree among the trees of the wood, so is my beloved among the sons." She said he's an apple tree and everyone else is just a tree of the woods. There's something different about him. He is sweeter, he's more fragrant than anyone else out there. Everyone else is just a tree, a scrub bush. There's nothing special about them. They're a dime a dozen, but he is an apple tree among the trees of the wood. That's the way that she sees him. Now, if you want to look as well, she too is asked what she sees in him. Notice in the Song of Solomon, chapter 5 and verse 9. Notice that someone comes to her and they're asking her the same question that others will ask of him. "What is thy beloved more than another beloved? O thou fairest among women." What makes him different than anyone else? What makes him greater than anyone else out here? They continue, "What is thy beloved more than another beloved, that thou dost so charge us?" Throughout the song, you'll find her charging them. Don't wake him up. Don't bother him. Don't upset him. Very protective of him. And they want to know, what's so special about him? And she's going to, in the context, say what's special about him. She says in verse 10, "My beloved is white and ruddy, the chiefest among 10,000. You remember the song that was sung of David? Saul has slain his thousands. David has slain his 10,000s. She says he's 1 in 10,000. She continues in verse 11. "His head is as the most fine gold. His locks are bushy and black as a raven. His eyes are as the eyes of doves by the rivers of waters, washed with milk and fitly set. His cheeks are as a bed of spices, as sweet flowers. His lips like lilies, dropping sweet-smelling myrrh. His hands are as gold rings. His belly as a bright ivory overlaid with sapphires. His legs are as pillars of marble." She didn't say bowls of jello, did she? She said pillars of marble, set upon sockets of fine gold. His countenance is as Lebanon, excellent as the cedars. And then she goes on to describe him even more. You see that the way that they describe one another is different than they see anyone else in the world. Now, if you look at Song of Solomon chapter 2 and verse 4, she's going to tell everyone that his banner over her was love. He made very clear how he felt about her and how much he loved her. She said, "His banner over me is love." Can you imagine? As she describes in that passage, "He brought me to the banqueting house." Can you imagine what it must have been like for her to be seated at the head table next to Solomon and all of these dishes and all of these guests gathered with her being the person to be honored. Imagine how special and how wonderful she felt. It reminds us of what's said in Genesis chapter 2 when woman is made from the rib of man and she's brought to man and Adam lays claim to her. He said, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." This is now is an exclamation, as we've talked about, of delight, where Adam says, "Wow, look at her." Amazed by the creation that God has brought to him. In 1 Corinthians 11, in verses 7 through 9, woman is described as the glory of the man. He is the head of the woman, but she is the crown that adorns the head. That's the way she's described in 1 Corinthians 11, in verses 7 through 9. But notice that he says of her in chapter 2 and verse 5, "I am sick of love." And this isn't a bad kind of sickness. This is a good kind of sickness. But it is a kind of sickness that fills your soul. It's a kind of sickness that overwhelms you. In fact, in the context of this very song, he's going to talk about how that she has ravished him with her love. Notice in Song of Solomon 4 and verse 9, "Thou hast ravished my heart, my sister, my spouse. Thou hast ravished my heart with one of thine eyes, with one chain of thy neck." He says, "You've ravished my heart. I'm sick of love. You've overwhelmed me." And notice he describes just one eye as having done that to him. Just one chain about her neck as having created that response in him. They see one another in a very different way than they see anyone else in the world. And that's the way that we're supposed to see our mate. They are supposed to be unique. They are supposed to be special. They are supposed to be one of a kind. That's the way we're supposed to view them. But notice in verses 8 through 10 that we have a call that takes place. We have several references to the voice. It says in verse 8, "The voice of my beloved." And then in verse 10, "My beloved spake." Here's the voice. And how sweet and how wonderful that voice is. But this voice is calling them away. Notice it says in verse 10, "My beloved spake and said unto me, Rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away." This is the voice that called them away. You remember in Genesis 2 and verse 24, "And for this cause shall a man leave father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh." Here's the calling away. Here's the calling away from one's home where they were born and where they were raised. Calling them away from that to set up a new home, a new place that they will build together. That's the picture here. Now throughout the book we have reference to the voice and how sweet it is. Notice in chapter 2 and verse 14, "O my love, thou art in the clefts of the rock, in the secret places of the stairs. Let me see thy countenance, let me hear thy voice, for sweet is thy voice." Notice how they feel about one another's voice. Let me hear it. Sweet is the voice. It's sweet because it's a voice that you know. It's sweet because it's a voice that you can recognize anywhere. It's sweet because it's a voice that reaches and touches to the depth of your soul. That's what's so sweet about this voice. But notice he continues in chapter 4 and verse 11. "Thy lips, O my spouse, drop as the honeycomb. Honey and milk are under thy tongue." You remember how Canaan was described as a land flowing with what? Land flowing with milk and honey. You know how marriage here is described, at least the voice connected with marriage? It's milk and honey. It is this promised land that we are privileged to inherit, that God has given to us. That's a good description of marriage. Do you remember when your husband asked you to marry him? Can you go back to that moment? Can you go back and hear his voice? Maybe it was shaking a little bit with emotion as he asked you that question. Can you remember her response when she said, "I do," or "I will"? Can you remember that? You know, we take that for granted, don't we? We go out of town sometimes for a few days and we go hours, maybe even we go a day or days, depending on where we are, without being able to hear our mate's voice. And then we call and we get to hear that voice again. And And it's renewed again. We're reminded again how sweet and how wonderful that voice is. That's what he's talking about here. Do you realize that there will come the day in this life when we won't get to hear that voice? Some of you know that all too well. Some of you can only recall that voice in your mind. You can only hear it there. You can't place that telephone call anymore and then pick up on the other end. You can't play back that message on the answering machine or in your voicemail and hear that voice again. But I know what you would tell those of us who've not yet reached that point. And I know you would tell us, don't take that for granted. Don't take that voice for granted. Don't forget the sweetness and the wonderfulness of that voice. And Solomon's telling us that same thing right here. But in the third place, we see a change. We see a change that takes place between verses 11 through verse 14. Notice he says in verse 11, "For though the winter is past and the rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, the time of the singing of birds is come, the voice of the turtle is heard in our land. The fig tree putteth forth her green figs, and the vines with the tender grape give a good smell. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away." He contrasts here winter with spring, and he's really contrasting his life before marriage and his life after marriage. And before it was like winter, and then after it was like spring. Think about the difference between winter and spring. Winter is cold, but spring is warm. Winter is barren, but spring is fruitful. Winter is known for its silence. Spring is known for the singing of birds. And yes, the sound of the turtle, which is literally the turtle dove in the land. Winter is known for clouds and rain. Spring is known for sunshine. Winter is rather fragrant-less. Not very much of a smell to wintertime. But springtime, we have the smell of flowers and the smell of vines, and we have all of these beautiful fragrances that fill the air again. He says that's the difference between life by yourself and life with someone else. That's the difference. That's what he's picturing. This is a love song, and he's portraying that in that way. You remember what God said in Genesis 2 and verse 18? It is not good for man to be alone. What did God do when Adam went from being by himself to having one made from him, out of him, to stand beside him? What was the transition that was made? Can we not describe it as from winter to spring? Not good to very good? That's the transition that was made when that took place. In Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 19, Solomon would say, "Whosoever findeth a wife findeth a good thing, and obtaineth the favor," or literally obtaineth the grace of the Lord. He obtains unmerited, undeserved favor. Here's the contrast. He goes from winter to spring when that takes place. That's the great transition involved in marriage. That's Proverbs 18 and verse 22. But we have a caution. Notice in chapter 2 and verse 15, he says, "Take us the foxes, the little foxes that spoil the vines, for our vines have tender grapes." He gives a warning, and the warning is that the little foxes can ruin the vines. Yes, the vines are fragrant. They give off this wonderful smell. And yes, they are fruitful and they're bearing grapes. But he says something can damage those vines. Something can rob it of its fruitfulness. And he warns of the foxes. And then he says the little foxes. Because sometimes we don't realize the damage that little things can do. And that's especially true in marriage. In marriage, sometimes we are concerned with the big things and what big things can do. And big things can do a lot of harm. Adultery, for example, can do a lot of harm. It's a big thing. It can do a lot of damage. But there are little things that can do a lot of damage. And there are little things that sometimes, not always, but sometimes precede the big things. Think about some of the little things that can damage. Think about anger. In Ephesians 4 and verse 26, Paul warns us to let not the sun go down upon our wrath. Why? Because anger can damage. It's a little thing, but it can be a big thing. Think about as well bitterness in Colossians chapter 3, where he tells husbands, love your wives and be not bitter against them. Bitterness is a little thing in comparison to maybe some other things, and yet it can be a big thing if we're not careful. Colossians 4 and verse 6 says, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer every man. Now think about the fact that speech is a little thing, and how we say things, we might say that's a little thing, but it can be a big thing. And that's why we're giving guidelines relative to how we speak in the words of our mouths. It's a caution. And he cautions about the little things because we probably note the big things. We're probably watching for the big things, but we might miss the little ones. He talks about a combination in verse 16. He says, my beloved is mine, and I am his. He feedeth among the lilies. Notice, he's mine, I'm his. We are one. Isn't that what was said in the very beginning when God created marriage, where Adam said, and for this cause shall a man leave father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Two becoming one. He's mine, I'm his. Just as we have here in this song. Here's this combination that is taking place. Now, there are a number of other times in the book where this happens as well. Notice chapter 6 and verse 3. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. He feedeth among the lilies. Notice in chapter 7 and verse 10. I especially like the language here, because it goes beyond just making the statement to explaining the statement. Chapter 7 and verse 10. I am my beloved's, and his desire is towards me. What does it mean that I am his and he is mine? What does that mean? It means that one's desire is toward that person. That's what it means to belong to another person. It means that your desire is toward that person and their desire is towards you. That's what it means. That's what love is. Perhaps that's what Paul had in mind in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 4 when he said, the wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Here is the combination that must take place. Sometimes there are problems that come in marriage because two never become one, or at least they don't stay one. Sometimes what happens is, rather than our life, and rather than the building of a life together, individuals become concerned with their own needs and their own wants and their own desires, separate apart from their mates. But true love, according to 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 5, seeketh not her own. It isn't selfish. Rather, it seeks the best for another person. That's the nature of love, whether we're talking about Christian love or we're talking about married love, or even the love of friends or neighbors, or even our love toward our enemies. It's seeking the best for that other person and not being selfish. But we see a commitment, finally, in chapter 2, in verse 17. The language here is beautiful. Until the day break and the shadows flee away. Here's the promise that until death do us part. Until the day breaks, until the shadows flee away, this is the commitment that we've made to one another. It's a lifelong commitment. It isn't a commitment of convenience. It isn't a commitment as long as love shall last. It is a commitment as long as life shall last. We're going to be together. Now, as we think about this commitment, you may want to notice chapter 4 and verse 6, where he again says, until the day break and the shadows flee away, I will get me to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. And then go to chapter 8 and verses 6 and 7. He says, set me as a seal upon thine heart, as a seal upon thine arm. For love is strong as death. Jealousy is cruel as the grave. The coals thereof are coals of fire, which hath a most vehement flame. Notice it's as strong as death in verse 6. And then in verse 7, many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it. If a man would give all his substance of his house for love, it would utterly be contemned. Water can't quench it. The floods can't drown it out. It's a love that endures. It's a love that will last. And we know that's what God designed. Malachi 2 and verse 16, God hates putting away. That hasn't changed. Jesus reiterated the original plan in Matthew chapter 19 when He was dealing with those that argued divorce for every cause. And the Lord narrowed it but to one. And He said, except for this cause. Not every cause, but for this cause, our Lord said. Romans chapter 7 and verse 2 says, the woman is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. Here's a love song. It's a song that Solomon and his bride sang to one another. And it's a song that husbands and wives who are following God's pattern continue to sing to one another. What a beautiful song it is. We have to make sure that as they were singing it to one another, that we're singing it today. For if we are not, then our song will not end as their song did. Our song can end abruptly. Our song can be off-key. Our song can not look anything at all like this song, unless we're following the pattern that God has given to us. Tonight, if you're here as a person who knows the plan of salvation, you've heard that plan and you've considered it and you understand that plan, then we offer our Lord's invitation to you, and we want you to understand that when you respond to the plan of salvation, what you're doing is you're marrying Christ. And it's a lifelong commitment that you're making. It's a commitment that you're making because you love Him and you feel differently about Him. You feel stronger about Him than you do about anything or anyone else in this life. You're putting Him first. You believe with all of your heart that He is God's Son. John 3 and verse 16. You're turning away from every sin. Luke 13, 3 and 5. You're confessing your faith in Him. Romans 10, 9 and 10. And you're willing to be immersed in water to have every sin washed away. Acts 2 and verse 38. As a child of God here tonight, if you've been unfaithful, you've been unfaithful to your mate, you've been unfaithful to Christ, He's been faithful to you, have you been faithful to Him? And if you have not, then here's your opportunity. Here's your opportunity to be restored to Him. Be in a right relationship with Him again. To remove the problems, because the problems are on your side, on your end. And through repentance, confession, and prayer, they can be removed. And reconciliation can take place. We invite you to come tonight, if you need to, as we stand and as we sing.